Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Rick Brick, and I'm one of the Prairies and Northwest Territories District Directors for the National Association of Federal Retirees. I'll be your host today for this webinar on the Canada Pension Plan and the potential Alberta Pension Plan. Our intent is to try and provide you with information on this important topic. I'm joining you today from Edmonton, Alberta, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land from which I'm joining you is the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of the Treaty 6 region and the Métis settlements and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. This land is a traditional meeting ground and a home for many Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Niitspa, who are more commonly referred to as Blackfoot, Métis, and the Nakota Sioux or Stoney people. Of course, locations across Canada, and I would encourage each of you to take a moment to acknowledge the land from which you're joining today's webinar and to reflect on how we can each move forward in reconciliation and collaboration. Federal Retirees is the largest national advocacy organization representing close to 170,000 active and retired members of the Federal Public Service, Canadian Armed Forces, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and retired federally appointed judges, their partners, and survivors. Since our beginning, we, federal retirees, have advocated to improve the lives of all Canadians in retirement and to protect our members' pensions and benefits that they have earned. Our nonpartisan advocacy work supports secure, healthy, and dignified retirements for federal retirees and indeed all Canadians. In September, the Alberta government presented the report it commissioned on the possibility of leaving the Canada Pension Plan and creating an Alberta Pension Plan. That same day, federal retirees asked members whether they support the Alberta government's proposal to exit the CPP. Members reacted decisively. In one day, over 10,000 members responded, with the majority, 95%, opposing the proposal. When asked whether federal retirees should be actively involved in defending the CPP and the Quebec Pension Plan, 95% responded with an unqualified yes. Since then, our staff team has fielded countless emails. Members are worried. Their members have questions, and we are listening. This is the purpose of hosting this webinar, which is going to focus on the Canada Pension Plan and what it would mean for Alberta to leave and create its own plan. We'll learn about the history of the CPP, its performance, and what Alberta's proposal could mean for retirement income security, both in Alberta and indeed right across Canada. I really want to thank everybody who's joining us this afternoon, and especially our guest speaker, Jeffrey Hodgins. Let me introduce Jeffrey. Jeffrey joined CPP Investments in 2017, and he oversees the Global Stakeholder Affairs function, which manages the organization's relationship with business, labor, community, and advocacy groups, as well as think tanks, academics, pension experts. Jeffrey has more than 20 years of experience as a financial journalist, and that really encompasses the work he's done on 3 continents. He began his career in Bloomberg News in Toronto and subsequently took on a variety of reporting and editing roles at Reuters. These include postings in London and Hong Kong, where he led coverage of Asia's asset management industry. He was also national business editor for the Canadian Press, overseeing the work of journalists in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Calgary, and Vancouver. Jeffrey holds a Bachelor of Journalism degree from Carleton University in Ottawa. Now, before we get started, we have a couple of instructions to help you make the most of the webinar. First, please note that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to everybody who registered later this week. While we share these screenshots, you will notice the speaker's video box as well. If the box hides some of the images we're sharing, simply minimize it by clicking the line in the top left corner or moving it by dragging it with your mouse elsewhere on the screen. To enter or exit full screen viewing on your device, click the button labeled Enter or Exit Full Screen at the top right-hand corner of the Zoom window. All attendees are in view mode only, which means you'll only be able to see the presenters. If you would like to ask a question during this webinar, and we encourage you to do that, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to open the Q&A window. From the Q&A window, you may type your question in the box and click Send, and that will submit your question. Note that all questions that we will answer during the webinar will appear above the question box. We'll be answering questions at the end of Jeffrey's presentation, but please type them as soon as you think of them. I'd also like to point out that you can vote on questions that have been submitted by clicking the thumbs up icon. This will help our team understand what you most want to know about today. If you see a question you would like to have answered, please click the thumbs up icon. Please note, Jeffrey can answer questions about how CPP works, its performance, and the potential consequences of an Alberta pension plan on the pensions of federal retirees and all Canadians across Canada. As there is much to be determined regarding an Alberta pension plan, however, Jeffrey cannot speculate on the specifics of what a plan may look like. We simply don't know yet. Jeffrey also cannot answer questions about personal finances. That's beyond the scope of what we're going to do in this presentation. And we will not reply to questions asking to take a partisan position. Our association is a non-partisan organization. We, however, want to make sure that you've got all of the information so you can make an informed decision. The chat option at the bottom of your screen is unavailable, so please be sure to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Should you need to leave the webinar at any time, simply click the red Leave button at the bottom right corner. With that, let's get started. And Jeffrey, over to you.
Rick, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Just in terms of acknowledgement, note that Katie and I, my colleague who's running our slides, we're coming to you out of Toronto, Treaty 13 territory. I myself originally from further west, St. Louis, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory. And so, yeah, very pleased and grateful that you're able to take the time to hear us from us today. So we're going to be going over a couple of things. At first, I'm just going to give an overview of a little bit about the Canada Pension Plan and CPP investments, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the considerations in the debate around an Alberta pension plan. Great. So some of you may know this, but basically give a sense of things. When people say CPP investments, what is that? How does it relate to CPP? Effectively, I characterize it as we're the investment engine of the plan. I'll go through shortly. We operate at arm's length. But yeah, we've been set up as a independent pension fund manager to manage the contributions, the CPP fund, not needed to pay current benefits that come to us. We're recognized by international governments as an independent pension manager. And while we're based and headquartered in Toronto, where I'm here today, we have global offices, 7 international offices, including in London and Hong Kong. And, more than 21 million Canadians participate in the Canada Pension Plan. So we have that connection and that sort of piece of it, including more than 2.8 million in Alberta. And again, to just sort of get to the crux and the purpose of what does our organization do, I'll be talking about the objectives under our legislation, but fundamentally, our purpose, help provide that foundation upon which more than 21 million Canadians build their financial security in retirement. Now, those objectives. If you are interested, and I always encourage people to have a look at things that pertain to their lives, you can go online and look at the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board Act that created us, that spells out our obligations. And you can see them here in terms of helping the Canada Pension Plan itself meet its obligations, manage the investments in the best interest of contributors and beneficiaries, and very clearly about how we invest. It's laid out. And you'll hear this phrase a little bit, invest to achieve a maximum rate of return without undue risk, having regard for the factors that may affect the funding of the Canada Pension Plan. Now, jumping back a little bit of history so people understand where we come from. So, the Canada Pension Plan itself was created in the 60s. Prior to that, many decades before that, sort of old age security had been sort of created at that point. But that was a taxpayer-supported plan. In the 60s, governments took a look and said, we'd still like to do more to support, set something up that will support Canadians in retirement. And at that point, part of it was the issue of that if you looked at, how seniors were doing, if you were a senior at that time, you were about twice as likely to be living in poverty as a working age Canadian. Now that situation has actually changed. And you're now half as likely to be living in poverty as a senior versus being a working age Canadian in Canada, and that's because of a number of things, including the Canada Pension Plan. So the Canada Pension Plan was created in the 1960s, and critically at that point, the government pensions remain a provincial responsibility under the Constitution. However, so the federal government, to make the Canada Pension Plan happen, had to go to the provinces and seek their cooperation. At this point, Quebec decided to set up its own plan in parallel with the other provinces, but it was the 9 other provinces and the federal government that reached this agreement to create the Canada Pension Plan. Now, when it was first set up, it was closer to what would be called a pay-go system, a term I didn't know until I worked here, but that for basically you have a system where at that point there were 6.5 workers for every retiree. Now, in a pay-go system, that means that existing workers can pay their contributions. It flows to the retiree, and if the system has that sort of balance, it can remain sustainable. But if you look at what happened over the following decades, family sizes became smaller, life expectancy increased, which I think we're all pleased about. However, that created a demographic challenge in the 1990s. Now, and you'll hear me talk about this a little bit as well. Every 3 years, the Canada Pension Plan is effectively checked out by something called the Office of the Chief Actuary in Ottawa. It's part of OSFI, the financial regulator. So they check out the plan and they come back to the stewards of the plan, the nine provincial finance ministers, including Alberta's, and the federal finance ministers, and say how the plan is doing. In the mid 1990s, those finance ministers got some very bad news. The Office of the Chief Actuary came and said, "We've done an assessment, and based on current trends." Now there was a fund set up at that point, partly invested in provincial government bonds to partly support things. They said that fund will be totally depleted by 2015 if you don't do anything, and you're either going to have to, slash benefits or massively hike contributions. Over to you to fix. Now, as part of the solutions for solving that in the 1990s, and it's very interesting, those finance ministers all, came from different political parties, different political perspectives, but they made a number of changes that they thought would result in this making the plan sustainable. And one of them was the creation of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. So at that point, we were created. We began investing. I think our first check flowed to us in 1999. And again, we were set up to, rather than invest just in safe but lower yielding provincial government bonds, they thought it would be, we would go out there and with the goal to maximize returns without undue risk, taking into account the needs of the plan, and getting those higher returns would put things on a more sustainable footing. Now, we do want to clarify, and as many people have questions about this when they meet me, they're like, "Oh, okay, I assume you're in Ottawa," and we explain, no, we're not actually in Ottawa because Canada Pension Plan is different than we're ultimately have that connection is understandable, but we're separate structures. So CPP, the federal provincial cooperative plan, is administered out of Ottawa, and it's the Economic and Social Development Canada department that administers those CPP benefits. So if you've turned 60 and you're thinking about, or you're waiting till you're 69 and you want to go claim your CPP benefits, you do that through that administrative structure out of Ottawa. CPP Investments is purely, the pension fund manager, so based out of Toronto, and we're there to invest those assets on behalf of things. And we're governed and managed independently from the CPP itself. When we're designed to operate at arm's length from government, that was the the original design agreed upon by the ministers. And importantly, all of the assets are segregated from government funds. But ultimately, we are accountable to those federal and provincial ministers who serve as our stewards. And again, people have talked about we've had some success in terms of generating returns, which I'll be speaking about. But in terms of the success, some commentators have said the reason things have gone well is we've been held up as a gold standard sort of for in terms of governance. So what's very critical is that we operate at arm's length. The structure is such that our management reports into an independent professional board of directors. And then that board of directors oversees, the selection of our CEO, overall investment policies, these sorts of things. So that gives us that arm's length. And I'll be talking about that legislatively, some levels of protection around that. At the same time, we are accountable, and we, in terms of accountability, for example, a lot of pension fund managers report their results about once a year. We actually report 4 times a year, and we're fairly. If you go to our website and look at the news section, you'll see we're quite diligent in terms of reporting on our quarterly results, reporting on our transactions. There are other levels of accountability. One of which, and I just want to put a bug in everyone's ear, so to speak, is every 2 years we have public meetings in every province that's a member of the Canada Pension Plan, and we'll be having our next round in 2024, and which means we'll be coming back to Alberta to host that. So I hope we can partner with the National Association of Federal Retirees to sort of make sure you're properly notified on that. Now, going back to that, I mentioned that level of political protection around things, because I do talk to a lot of contributors and beneficiaries who are like, I've heard good things and I like it, but I'm worried that governments are going to start telling you exactly, what to invest in and this sort of thing. And we explain the structure. No, we operate while we're accountable to the stewards. We operate at arm's length and have that independent board of directors. And then people say, well, couldn't that be changed? For example, couldn't the federal government come in and change that? And the answer is no, because this is pensions are a provincial responsibility. It is a cooperative model. And in order to change our legislation, you need both the federal government and then 2/3 of the provinces with representing 2/3 of the population. So I've sometimes in previous presentations said, oh, well, what if the federal government and all opposition parties and every federal MP decided it would be good for us to invest in, a widget factory? That would be they could they could change the legislation, try to go to pass it, but they can't actually, they could try, but they can't actually do it without the approval of 2/3 of the provinces with 2/3 of the population. So that it represents a level of protection for, again, in preserving that arm's length relationship that is part of our model. Now, the important factor, people often ask, how are you doing? How have you done? How, the contributions that flowed to you, what did you deliver? Well, we have some good news there. If you look here, and we very much focus on our long-term returns, things do fluctuate. We report every quarter, but we point out that the long-term returns are important. And over the last 10 years, our net nominalized return is 9.6%. So that's averaged out over that time after all expenses. So 9.6%, and that result is, there's benefits there in terms of that compounding effect. So we've been able to deliver a strong return, and including in relative to sort of looking at it on a global level. So in terms of that global level, this is there are some numbers from an independent consultancy. It's called Global SWF, based out of New York. They did an assessment over 10 years because they track both independent national pension fund managers like ourselves, major pension fund managers, and then also sovereign wealth funds, which we are not a sovereign wealth fund. We're different because we operate as an independent pension fund manager. Taking a look, they went in to see who had the highest performance over 10 years. And if you look at this chart, you'll see we were the #1 global pension fund manager in terms of the performance. At that point, our 10-year annualized return was 10.9%. So 10.99% annualized. And that meant we had a higher returns, not just than any other major Canadian pension fund manager, not just, any US manager looking at the big ones like California, teachers and that sort of thing. If you look globally at all major pension fund managers, our returns were the highest over that 10-year period. In fact, they were also higher than every other sovereign wealth fund operating in the world, with the exception of New Zealand Super, which had a 12.1% annualized. But otherwise, again, other than that, all other sovereign wealth funds and all of our global peers, we were number one in that ranking. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about how we invest and work to achieve those returns and align with our mandate. Global presence is part of that. Based out of Toronto, but our first two, there's always been a little debate about the London and Hong Kong offices, who exactly opened first. They started very small, but they've grown out, and we've grown a network globally in major markets. And the reason we do this is that we think having, and we've taken a look, having in effect boots on the ground to both look at existing transaction opportunities, be there and be able to assess, and then also the existing assets that we have, sort of having close oversight of those and seeing how they're doing, the dynamics impacting them. So we think that setting up these global offices, this global network, has facilitated us finding those great investment opportunities. Now, another thing I'll talk about is the fact that we are an active manager. And this started, I believe, in April 2006. Our board took a look at an assessment and said, at that point, they were beginning to invest into equity markets, so holdings of government fixed income and some other things. But the question was, should we kind of, just track markets, go out and effectively sort of track the index, or would it be possible for us to meet our legislative objective, maximize returns without undue risk, taking into account? And the decision was made that, yeah, we could do this. And the organization, it was out of a belief that, we have both structural advantages natural to us, and then developed advantages, which we have to continually work at. So those structural advantages include a very long horizon, can be very patient investors. And I can think of, even in the brief time I've been here, more than 6 years, where we've seen those opportunities sort of come about. Scale, the size and scale and reach that allows to go into large and very complex transactions that can deliver the risk-adjusted returns we're looking for, and that certainty of assets. And again, the markets fluctuate, and there's some market players who have to, if things get strained, they have to step out. Sometimes that can be a time we can step in, and that can, when that can be a good investment opportunity for us. But the developed advantages we also are things we have to continually focus on. Talent is absolutely critical, maintaining world-class investment teams, and also another one, expert partnerships and relationships. We also have something we call a total portfolio approach. I'd encourage you to look on our website. We spell these out in detail a little bit more. And again, just going to, in terms of the fund, we've got a very global orientation, and we get, a former Nobel Prize winning economist said something to the effect of the diversification is the only free lunch in investing. So we do know and recognize the benefits of diversification, both geographic and asset class, and I'll be talking a little bit about. But if you look here, you can see, a lot of pension funds, individuals sort of, you can invest in public equities. We can all go out and buy a stock, if we have a brokerage account or access, fixed income, this sort of thing. But our organization also invests in, private equity, and also something we call real assets, which includes, real estate, but also, infrastructure. And in addition, on the fixed income side, we also have developed our own in-house credit sort of function as well. We are a significant investor in Alberta. Within our Canadian holdings, we're actually, last time I checked, slightly overweight Alberta, other jurisdictions, and that includes, major holdings. There was, some of you may have seen an announcement about Dow building a major, petrochemical complex near Edmonton, which is designed to be net zero. Wolf Midstream, one of our, majority-owned holdings in the province, it actually operates something called the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, which will be used to capture the carbon and to help with that, create that carbon neutrality. So as you can tell, we're pretty significant investors in the province as well. And finally, if I have one message about us as a whole, and when we talk to people, if you go out there, and we've seen polls that say most Canadians either don't know whether or don't believe that the Canada Pension Plan will be there for them. What we put out there is we point out to what the Office of the Chief Actuary has done. The same Office of the Chief Actuary in 1990, in the 1990s, who said the plan will, be out of, drain its savings funds reserves in 2015. They said as a result of factors including the investment returns we've contributed, their most recent report projects the plan is going to be able to meet its obligations at current rates for at least the next 75 years. So I enjoy doing this with, if you have a niece or nephew or a family member at a party, say, oh, but CPP won't be there for us. You can say, well, actually, there's something called the Office of the Chief Actuary, and they've projected, and we do this because we want to. A lot of Canadians are concerned about their finances out there, and understandable. CPP was not set up to meet the entire needs of people in retirement, but it was there to become that foundation and we believe that letting people know what has been said about the stability of that foundation can help them in terms of their own thinking and planning around things. Now, the question of the day, the Alberta Pension Plan. A lot of you have heard about this. I'm just going to talk around some of the factors and considerations that as this has been put out, and along with a little bit of history. So the idea of an Alberta pension plan, one of the most notable sort of points when it came about was more than 20 years ago, when a younger Stephen Harper participated in something written out of Alberta called the Firewall Letter, and that was at a time known as the Firewall Letter. That was a time where again, provincial, and again, I'm from Saskatchewan, and understand that relationships between, in particular, some Western provinces and the federal government have at times moved up and down. At that point, there was tension there, and the suggestion was brought out: what if the Alberta government could exercise constitutional rights to take back all manner of things, which would include potentially an Alberta pension plan? Ralph Klein. Actually took a look at that and said no, was not interested, did not think it made sense, and so the idea fell somewhat fallow for till about after 2019, when Premier Kenney and the United Conservatives came to power. At that point, they set up something called the Fair Deal Panel to examine the idea, which suggested further study. An organization then called Morneau Chappelle, now known as LifeWorks, was hired to study the report, and that report was released in 2023. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I think many of you have seen that in the headlines. That came after the election of Premier Daniel Smith earlier this year. Now, there's, in terms of that report, it came out with a very, very notable number, which I'll talk about next, and has captured a lot of attention. But it talked about the case to be made for an Alberta pension plan. Things, some of the factors considered here. I'd like to talk you through some of those and just to understand and share some perspective on them, and how those we should be, Albertans might want to have this information as they look to make a decision. Ultimately, and you'll hear me say this again, this decision does sit with Alberta and Albertans. Again, pensions are provincial responsibility under the Constitution, which is why this is it was in the realm of possibility. So, first of all, this report came out and said the province would be entitled to $334 billion, or about 53% of our existing CPP fund, which you've seen there, and that's was immediately. What's striking about that number is since CPP was created, Albertans have contributed about made 16% of contributions. So the argument about that is how could they come up with this number? Now, if you take a look at that LifeWorks report, and we've spoken to it, and you could see some of our comments in the media immediately following. But within the LifeWorks report, they come out and they say, and within the legislation, there is a formula. The legislation that would effectively the Canada Pension Plan legislation, which was set up in the 60s. Now, that was well before we were there and we were created. It's interesting. There's been commentators speaking to what they think of that language. University of Calgary's Professor Trevor Tombe referred to it in a column as a vague mess. And what's complex about it is it lays out a formula, but that formula doesn't immediately equal, 100%. So when LifeWorks took a look, they said, oh, okay, if we use this formula A plus B, Alberta is actually entitled to 118%, or 117, moving to 118% of the entire fund. But that's not feasible because, that obviously doesn't make sense. So they came up with their own formula, which they had to invent. So we have articulated that, again, this was something that was invented. The Act says 118%, and yet 117 or 118% according to their interpretation. But that being said, that obviously doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And the case to be made for an Alberta pension plan that's, Professor Toom has made some great points that, if it's predicated on this 53%, he thinks that number is too high, and therefore, any result benefits projected from that would be too high. Another consideration, and the reason it's being brought up, is the whole, the fact that Alberta has both demographically a younger population and a wealthier population. But some considerations are that, demographics will over time, while the population is younger now, there are questions about always what will be the way forward in the future and how will things unfold. And we have a bit of an illustrative example about that. So there's contribution rates that are a consideration there. Another thing, and we'll talk a little bit about this. I mean, in terms of how people pay, the plan is harmonized across the country from a worker and retiree perspective. If you pay, the same amount, whether you're in Toronto, whether you're in Alberta, whether you're in St. Louis, Saskatchewan, somebody making and earning the same thing and paying in is going to get the same benefit. But it is the case, and the LifeWorks report didn't have access to the data to sort of capture things like, for example, I have three younger siblings, and two of them, when they were younger, I think in their 20s, went to work in Alberta and spent a number of years, but then moved back to Saskatchewan. But the LifeWorks report, wouldn't have captured that level of movement. Yeah. Going back to the questions of contribution rates, Quebec sits as a bit of a cautionary tale in the sense of when Quebec was set up, decided to align with the, set up their own plan from the start. So you wouldn't have to unravel anything. They were separate from the word go. But one consideration around the time is that Quebec had actually a younger population, and would be the case where policymakers could take a look and say, oh, well, we have a younger population, and Quebec had a larger, Quebecers tend to have larger family size at that time, and therefore from that pay-go perspective, we'd have that benefit, the benefit that Alberta has today of that younger population. However, in Quebec, that shifted, and in fact, it swung quite significantly. So Quebec has, going from having a younger than average Canadian population to an older than average. So Quebecers, as a result of that demographic change, actually pay more for the QPP to get the exact same benefits as the CPP. So if you're outside of Canada in the CPP, again, your rate is lower versus what Quebec is. And again, that's because demographics shifting over time can impact things. Another consideration is portability, and this has been a concern raised within the Alberta business community. I've heard some leaders talking about this, and the fact is, and the point I just spoke to of siblings going to work from Saskatchewan going to work, like again, members of my high school graduating class, a lot of them headed into Alberta because they could work on major projects. The energy industry requires a lot of mobile labor from outside of Alberta to support things. And one of the great things about the Canada Pension Plan is that portability. Nobody has to think about, if you're running a large operation and you need to bring in workers from elsewhere in Canada, how to process and manage, and the whole management of their retirement is, CPP contributions. It's all harmonized. And likewise, if you're a worker and let's say you're from the Maritimes or Saskatchewan and you want to go work in Alberta during peak years, but then decide you want to retire someplace else like Saskatchewan, you don't have to worry about your benefits following you. So there are some concerns among businesses about that. Anything that creates friction in terms of accessing quality labor, that's one reason some business leaders have spoken out against this. Also, that question of political interference. And again, just to stress, right now, if the federal government decided to make a change to the CPP, they need seven of provinces representing two-thirds of the provinces with two-thirds of the population. However, if there were an APP, whatever the government of the day is, they could make changes ultimately to the way the plan is run. And I've heard some people say, "Oh, I'd like an APP actually, and I trust this government and this leader to sort of make oversee that." And one thing we just point out is that is Albertans will decide this. But one thing you have to consider is, going forward, what will future governments and future leaders sort of decide about the way the plan ought to be run? And so that's a consideration as well. Um, and, a lot of people have seen the polls out there, and again, in terms of support for an Alberta pension plan, it's not terrifically popular. There's far more opposition than that. The Alberta government has said that they would put this to, potentially put this to a referendum. If it were based on these numbers today, there's again clearly not that support there for an APP. But of course, polls can change. One interesting element of the LifeWorks report as well, and I've heard a lot from about Albertans, is the cost of implementation. So what you have to remember is that right now, one thing that we have to set up is that, Albertan, and this was tried in Ontario when Ontario looked at an Ontario pension plan, which they wanted to supplement, not replace the Canada pension plan because they thought there'd be more pension coverage. But they went in to look at administration and realized, they would have to set up an administrative structure tied to every employer in the province. So now that all happens automatically. If you run a small business, if you run a major business, major corporation, you remit taxes and CPPs through the CRA. But in terms of something provincial, so that would have to be implemented. Now the cost of this could be as high, they argued, as $2.2 billion. And again, this would be potentially up to $2.2 billion just to sort of start up and implementation, those costs. And again, this is all for work that already exists, already being done, already happening, consistently year after year. So some critics have talked about that, and some businesses, I think, have articulated concerns that the administration of the additional potential administration or changeover, because every employer as well would have to sort of deal with all of this. Yeah. And again, one of the benefits of risk pooling of the Canada Pension Plan, you saw with situation where Quebec, a smaller jurisdiction, demographic change could buffet it. With here, you've got a situation where it's like an insurance company. This sort of thing. The more you're able to pool and pool that risk widely, you get the benefits from that level of scale. The process on a CPP, potential withdrawal is complex. It would take multiple years, and it would sort of kick off from if the government were to proceed with a referendum, it would have to go from there through the steps you can see on the screen. Anyways, that is the main points that I want to go over and make sure that people have an understanding of, the Canada Pension Plan and our role within it and some of the considerations here. But again, we've talked a lot. Our CEO, John Graham, was just in Calgary speaking at an event we co-hosted with the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and just talking about what we offer. We want to make sure that Albertans make this choice, that we can provide you with information about who we are, what we do, what we provide in terms of our performance, and ultimately awareness about that sustainability of the plan according to the Office of the Chief Actuary, the benefits of the arm's length relationship, our global diversification and asset mix. So with that, we'll open the floor to questions.
Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. We do have a number of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. The very first one that we've got is from Nellie, and she wants a bit more information about the independence of the CPPIB. Perhaps, for example, if the Prime Minister decided tomorrow to tell you guys to invest more in Nunavut, what would your obligation be?
Well, again, our obligation is under the legislation. So, that first slide, the legislation's clear. Invest with, go with maximize returns without undue risk, etc. So it's the legislation that we worked that our board sort of responds to and we managed under. And again, that legislation can't be changed. So a prime minister can say, I'd like you to do more here, but you would have to change the legislation, and to get that, you need 2/3 of the provinces, 2/3 of the situation. Now, so this has been talked about a bit, and the idea of where we invest, and we may want to, invest more in Nunavut, but it would, and we always appreciate, and I'd encourage you to look at Michel Leduc, who's our head of public affairs and communications and communications, was quoted as recently. He was talking a little bit about this, and he's like, well, look, we like to go, we go fish where the fish are, and where there's appealing commercial terms, good certainty, good markets. Now again, 14% of the fund is invested in Canada right now, and we invest here because we want to invest here in alignment with our mandate, meaning there's good investment opportunities. So we're always on the outlook for that. But in terms of what we have to do, that's dictated by the legislation, and that can only be changed with the support of 2/3 of the provinces, 2/3 of the population.
Thanks, Jeff. We've got a couple of questions around the concern of Alberta being able to create their own pension plan. If it requires 2/3 of provincial agreement with 2/3 of the population,
Okay.
how can Alberta go on their own? The idea that, a lot of people who are contributing to CPP did that on the assumption that they would get CPP. How can Alberta just unilaterally do this?
Again, that's a great question. So that 2/3 applies to our legislation, and changing that there. But that doesn't stop any province. Any of the nine provinces in the Canada Pension Plan could decide, yeah, actually, I want to, and go through the steps laid out in the original CPP Act to give notice and that sort of thing. So the power does sit with provinces. So again, changing our investment mandate as it exists, 2/3, you need 2/3, 2/3. But in terms of a province leaving the plan, because the constitutional responsibility sits with the province, any Canadian province that is a member of the Canada Pension Plan has the power to do that.
Thank you so much. A question from Judy. Where do you track where CPP recipients are now? People are receiving pension. Do you track how many are in each province, et cetera? I think you had a slide that showed that, but.
Yeah, that is actually tracked. I don't know if the numbers that we got are from there or from census data, or StatsCan data, but the administrator of the plan is, I always get the department name wrong. Service Canada is the one we talk to. It's the Economic and Social Development Canada. So again, they work with the CRA. So when employees are remitting and that sort of thing, and then when people apply, it's all sort of centralized through that administration structure in Ottawa. So it's tied into, you've got your tax records in there, you've got all of that. So that's where the administration is done. So it's not us tracking that. That would be the Canada Pension Plan tracking all of that. And again, because if you can, again, you've worked in Alberta, you've moved to Saskatchewan, you decide you apply to put in, you will need your social insurance number, which you've used your entire working life, and that is sort of tracked within the system, tied to tax records, at which point they can say, Jeffrey Hodgson remitted, X amount of CPP contributions over his years, matched by his employer. Therefore, based on the formula, he's entitled to this.
Okay, thank you. Terry wanted to know if an Alberta pension plan would have any effect on GIS and OAS as it's currently structured.
Not to the best of my knowledge. Again, these are completely separate plans. So, and we had sometimes we didn't use it this time, a slide with pillars, of the different pillars of the retirement system, private savings, workplace plans for those lucky enough to have them, and including, I think, National Association of Federal Retirees, your retirement would be managed through our peer PSP. GIS and OAS are a separate pillar, taxpayer supported, managed by the federal government, so different from the CPP pillar. And if there were to be an APP, that would be its own pillar.
Thank you. This may be a long answer, and if it is, perhaps we'll move on to a different question.
I'll get a little sip of water too. Yeah.
The question came by email and it was wanting to know about, is there a board that administers CPP? And if so, how are they chosen? What are their qualifications? So again, I know that can be a lengthy answer, but
Yeah, no, so we have an independent board. I think we have a slide which can show the pictures of them. Katie's brought it up. There it is. So the independent board of directors. So that is basically the board is appointed by our stewards. So those, the 10 federal finance ministers, and this board is set up to be, basically set up to be financial professionals. So to give you a sense, if you took in the top left, we have a new chair, Dean Connor. If you follow the business pages, you might know him. He's the former CEO of Sun Life. So he's since retired as Sun Life CEO, but has come onto our board. And likewise, you might see Nadir Mohammed there. He's the former CEO of Rogers Communications, who again, has come onto our board. And again, the steward's sort of looking at and signing off on approving the appointment of our board. And Judith, who I am seeing, just looking here, yes, Judith Azade, just beside to the right of Dean. She's from Alberta. She was actually involved at one point in the construction of, I think it's called the Bow building in Calgary. But she worked in Calgary business for a significant amount of years. So again, the goal with the creation of the board is that it be, financial professionals with the deep knowledge of operating in business, so that we have that strong level of oversight.
thank you. Ramnick wanted to know about the Quebec pension plan and how is it managed and structured? Where does it invest compared to CPP and compared to others?
Yeah, so some of you may know a big, effectively, there after us, there's the second largest pension fund manager in Canada, the Caisse de dépôt, based out of Montreal. So when the QPP was set up, at the same time as CPP, a separate but aligned in terms of, and to this day aligned in terms of benefits paid out. The Quebec government decided that the Caisse de dépôt would run those funds, which they do to this day. What's slightly different about them is they have a dual mandate to, both seek returns, but also contribute to the economic development of Quebec specifically. So it's slightly, has an added level of complexity versus our mandate, which is that maximize returns without undue risk, taking into account the needs of the plan.
Sticking to QPP, if that's okay. One of the
Yes,
questions that came was, how did they deal with portability? Somebody who is a Quebecois, they live in Quebec, they contribute in Quebec, but when they retire, they move to BC.
Yeah.
Is there a portability issue?
There's an agreement that was reached between CPP and QPP from the start to sort of exchange and account for this. I don't have the exact details around that, but effectively that was the structure that's set up in place. So, and to achieve that, one of the important things was that the alignment of benefits, so that again, the benefits would be equal in terms of the the amount of time worked, that sort of thing. But the contributions are higher. But yeah, they're set up to talk to each other. There are some administrative issues still. I've talked to payroll professionals who note that, there's some friction in terms of if you have somebody in Gatineau who's working and you want to in your Canadian, retailer, and you want to move them across the river, there's some complexity there as well. It's not as seamless as elsewhere. But yeah, that system was set up, and it's less complex because because they were always sort of separate plans, made it easier to do that versus where you'd have to do something where you're kind of unscrambling the omelet. Yeah.
Thank you. Diana, I should say, asked a question about if CPP were totally disaggregated, what would happen by jurisdiction? I don't know if we have that information, but if Alberta shares 53% in this report from LifeWorks,
Mm-hmm.
is there any sense applying that same methodology, what each of the individual provinces and territories share would be? We know it's more than 100%, obviously, but I don't know if anyone's...
This is the thing. It would be, it's more than 100%, again, based on that one, and other provinces like BC or Ontario could also come in and get, very significant amounts. So yeah, it's a tremendous amount of uncertainty looking at that. How would that have to play out if you've got a formula that doesn't, sort of that raises those challenges? So I just speak to a lot of uncertainty around that. But yeah, there are other provinces that could also come out, give notice and make similar sort of claims theoretically. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got about 8 minutes left, Jeffrey, so I'll just continue with
Mhm.
questions for as long as we can.
Yeah.
A question around how your process is for choosing who you invest in, when you choose to stop investing into it, you terminate it. What's involved in that? Who actually makes those decisions?
Great question. So, on the ground, in terms of active investments, those major transactions we have investment teams who take a look at those. And for example, let's say we're buying, a hypothetical, an asset, a real estate asset somewhere. They go in, they do the assessment, they say, look, this looks like a good opportunity at potentially at this price, but not that price. And then we go in and, if we get that asset, we then sort of continue to monitor it and look at it, as an asset and its performance. And we also have to look at, sort of our risk mix, which don't want to get too technical, but if you look at our annual report, I'd encourage you to look in there because it talks about how sort of the divide of our portfolio on the bigger part base CPP as you'll see in there, it's designed to be about 85% equity, like, 15% fixed income safer. So we have to make an assessment, how does this fit within the portfolio in terms of the risk level it offers, the potential returns going forward. So it's a constant assessment. And then the investment teams for major investments, we have investment committees that review that, sort of going up. Some transactions that go up and are seen by the board. So we do have that. It's that very rigorous. The organization is mostly investment professionals taking a look at assets, either potential transactions or existing assets, and deciding, what should we bid on, what should stay in the portfolio, making these decisions constantly, but always within the context of maximize returns without undue risk, taking into account the needs of the plans.
Great. A question around the idea that with pension plans, we contribute usually, let's say, 2%.
Mhm.
But for the part that is covered by CPP, it is a lesser contribution because it factors in the CPP. Would that be affected? Would military RCMP, public sector pensions be affected by an APP in that regard?
Well, it's getting speculative there because then what is the nature of the APP? Like right now, CPP is a known quantity, and so again, we don't, we support, we generate the returns. The CPP is set up and structured as it is. It's been deemed sustainable for 75 plus years. So there's that, and then consequently, for employer plans, have a lot of them, and I've heard a lot of this and asked a lot of questions. They build off of that, and because they know that. They have that line of certainty. Where things go with an APP in terms of structuring and what exactly the benefits are and this sort of thing. Again, I'd be speculating. There's discussion about what it might mean, but we're talking about, again, a hypothetical plan, and how it all might play out. So I will just speak to the certainty that with the existing plan and why that, the advantage of that certainty is that other plans are able to sort of build in and around it. Yeah.
You spoke to the issue of both pension plan being looked at by Ralph Klein as the Alberta Premier and it being
Mhm.
looked at in the Ontario situation and them deciding that if I understood you correctly, the administration costs were simply prohibitive. Could you speak a bit further to that?
Well, the costs were part of it. I just know this in the wake of it that I've spoken to people who were involved in that who said the setup costs and administration were like pretty staggering when they realized, because again, the provincial government doesn't have this relationship with every single employer the way the federal government does through CRA and payroll and EI and all those remittances. So that's a longstanding existing structure. They realized we have to do that from scratch. Interestingly, at that time, there was an Ontario Liberal government that was looking to expand what they said. And actually, their belief at the time was, what really ought to happen is CPP ought to be expanded. And we don't want to, our second choice, our plan B would be to build something ourselves, but we don't want that. It would be more effective to expand the CPP. At the time, initially, the federal government was prior to the current Liberal government, so they were not supportive of that. But when the current Liberal government came in, there was an alignment, and then all of the provinces came together. Now, it was a CPP enhancement that has been coming into effect subsequent to that. And just to give you, I'll get into some numbers here. Prior to the change, CPP was designed to replace about 25% or a quarter of the average industrial wage. So average industrial wage is here. And what that worked out to At this point, a quarter of the average industrial wage would be around, I believe, around $13,000 or $14,000. Meaning, if you paid into CPP for 40 years at the max rate, you would get, that $13,000 or $14,000, and then indexed to inflation as part of the CPP plan. With this enhancement, the idea is to increase that to a third of the average industrial wage. So, but this is being done incrementally. But the idea is that by the time it's done, again, somebody working 40 years paying the maximum in would earn the third of the average industrial wage, which works out to about 20 to 21,000 Canadian dollars, and then in real dollars indexed to inflation for life. So I mentioned earlier, CPP was never set up to be the be all and end all. People would say, I don't think I can live on $13,000 or even $21,000, but it was designed to be a foundation. So with Ontario, they had wanted that enhancement or change, and their policy logic was saying that a lot, I'm speaking to the National Association of Federal Retirees. I know that you operate under a number of defined benefit pension plans, which are managed by our peer, PSP. But a lot of, the policy argument was that a lot of Canadians don't have those plans these days. So the belief was, enhance CPP so that if you're self-employed, if you're working from, you're moving from organization to organization, CPP or province to province within Canada, the CPP always sort of follows you around. So that was the logic at the time. So yeah, it resulted in enhancement of the plan, which meant we have more assets to manage. Yeah.
Thank you. This will be our last question, and we've got maybe 2 minutes, and it's probably a pretty significant one. And it's who's actually going to make the decision as to how much Alberta gets out of the CPP pot when they leave? Do the other provinces get to have a veto power or a say in it, or
well, my understanding is the structure is the federal government would have to come to that. Take a look at that and work with the province on that. I think it's the Federal Department of Finance, I believe, administratively would have to, come to that. But then I guess the question is, what happens if there's not agreement there? And then does that mean things end up in court or not, or how does that play out? So there's I won't speak too much more because there's a lot of uncertainty around that. But as you can have a sense, the existing structure is, I think that the federal finance department is there to make that decision and sign off. But then what if any province that actually I'm not happy about that? So these are the dynamics that are in play, and what is contributing to that uncertainty. I'm sorry, I don't have the more sort of clear, definitive answer of what would happen, but we're dealing with, again, a tremendous uncertainty here.
Absolutely, and I think safe to say it would almost certainly end up in the court system, and we would see it going through the judicial system as there's challenges. But it's beyond my capacity to speak to, and I'm guessing beyond yours as well. So I want to thank you guys so much, Jeffrey, yourself, for the presentation. People haven't seen, but behind the scenes we have Katie, who's moving slides back and forth, and very much appreciate you guys taking the time. I also want to thank Patrick and Amy Sayward from our team, who are here helping us well. And I want to thank everybody who took the time to be involved in this. We will be sharing the recording as soon as possible. We will be asking you for a bit of an evaluation, because I'm guessing we're going to see this happening a number of times during the next few years. And so we want to get it right. So anything you can provide us by ways of improving it would be very much appreciated. So you'll see that evaluation coming in your email. That's all the time we have for today. Your expertise in that of CPPIB is amazing, and we thank you for sharing that with us. And again, thank you to everybody who was able to be here. I've got 12 o'clock right on the nose, so I'm going to say goodbye and wish everybody a good week. Take care.
Thank you so much.